Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. I know you have busy lives, and it means a lot to Travis and I that you'd come out and hear us talk a little bit about this book. And we want to, not talk too long, because we'd love to have a conversation with you about how to fix this great state of Illinois and how we can just make America a more prosperous place. So let me start by saying, I don't know. Yesterday I was watching. When I was flying out here, I was at the airport and they had C-SPAN on. I don't know how many of you saw this, that Obama was at some school in Michigan and talking to some teachers and some of the young kids, and I think the kids looked like they were about 4th, 5th grade, and he started taking some questions from the kids. Did any of you see this? And it was really interesting. He said, I want to take some questions from the children. Any questions? The little boy raised his hand. Son, what's your name? He said, my name is Oliver, Mr. President, and I just wanted to ask you a couple questions. I mean, first of all, I just wanted to ask you about Benghazi. If you think maybe you could have acted sooner and more decisively, and we might have saved the lives of the ambassador there. And then just one other quick question, Mr. President. My parents just recently lost their health insurance, and you had said that if you like your health insurance, you get to keep it. And I wonder if you were lying to my parents. You can see Obama; he's very rarely speechless, right? He just had no idea. You could tell what to say to this young boy, and just about his opening his mouth, the recess bell rings and all the kids scatter outside for a recess, and they come back 15 minutes later. The president's still there chatting with some of the teachers, so they all reassemble, and he said, where was I? Oh yes, I was taking some questions from the kids. Are there any questions from any of the children? Well, this adorable little girl in the front of the room raised her hand. Young lady, what's your name? Well, my name is Grace. Well, Grace, what is your question? She says, well, first, Mr. President, why did the recess bell go off 15 minutes early this morning? And second of all, what the hell happened to Oliver? That's called executive. So here, let me just, in a very nutshell, kind of explain what our book is about, and then Travis can fill in the details. I mean, if you haven't seen his book on How Money Walks, it really is the essence of what our book is about, with a little bit more kind of academic evidence and so on. But let me kind of give you the thesis of how we came up with the idea of doing this, which is, in America today, what I believe the most important political trend that is going on in our country that people aren't paying attention to is that the red states are getting redder and the blue states are getting bluer. And this is just an undeniable trend that is going on around the country. So I travel all over this great country of ours, and if I go to Chicago and then go to Boston, Massachusetts, and then go out to say Los Angeles 1 week, and then let's say the next week I go to Birmingham, Alabama, or Salt Lake City, Utah, or Atlanta, Georgia, or maybe go to Lawrence, Kansas, or something like that. I might as well be in 2 different countries. I mean, the political views and the economic views and policies and the kind of cultural views of these states, it's almost like we have 2 different countries right now. And one of the points that, if you look at the last couple of elections, it's very clear what's happening is that the red states, the Republican states, are getting even more Republican. So if you go to these southern states today, almost every state south of the Mason-Dixon line now is just overwhelmingly Republican today, with a few exceptions, but for the most part that's the case, where Democrats are essentially an endangered species in those states. Meanwhile, in the blue states, it's exactly the opposite. So Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, unfortunately Illinois, California are becoming states where Republicans have become endangered species. I know there are several legislators in this room, and thank you all for coming. The Democrats have not just the governorship, but they have gigantic majorities in both houses. And that's the way it is in a lot of states. Now, why is that important from a policy point of view? And the reason it's an important kind of trend is that the red states are adopting, to put it in a shorthand way, the red states are adopting Reaganomics. And the blue states to put it in a shorthand way, are adopting Obamonomics, right? I mean, the red states are cutting taxes, they're deregulating, they're right-to-work states, they are drilling for their energy resources, and I could go on and on. The blue states doing exactly the opposite. They're increasing their spending, they are raising tax rates on the rich, they're raising their minimum wages, they're not allowing, you know, any drilling because fracking is an evil thing and so on. By the way, I was here about 6 months ago, there was a move to try to ban fracking in Illinois. Have they done that yet, or what's that? Thank God, I mean, because you actually do have a lot of energy resources in the state. In any case, so you've got this polarization, if you will, of policy regimes in these two sets of states. Now, as a social scientist and an economist, this actually sets up a nice experiment, right? Because, you know, you've got a kind of polarization. You've got the southern states that are cutting their tax rates. You got Illinois, what was it, 3, now it's 5. They're talking about 9%. That's happening in New York and all these other states that I was mentioning. And so the differential between the states are getting wider. You see what I'm saying? So now you've got a nice experiment to see whether this stuff matters. And what we're finding, and this is sort of the premise of the book, is that these policies, like taxes, like right to work, like you know, your willingness to drill for your resources and so on, and deregulate your economy, not only do these matter, but they matter a whole hell of a lot. And the left denies this. They say, oh, taxes don't matter, right to work doesn't matter, on and on and on. So what we show in the book, I think in a really compelling way, and almost, I would say irrefutably, that these policies really do make a huge difference. And I'll just give you a couple of statistics to sort of document this. So my favorite shorthand way of explaining this is that if you look at the 4 largest states in the United States, you know what these are. They're Texas, California, Florida, and New York. And just as luck would have it, 2 of those states are red states. Florida and Texas obviously are red states, and 2 of them are deep red states, New York and California. So we asked the question in the book, you know, and by the way, 1 out of every 3 Americans lives in those 4 states, so they matter a lot in terms of how the country is doing. Well, then you look at how over the last 5 years or 10 years or 20 years or whatever time period you want to look at to see how these states are doing in terms of their economy, in terms of their population growth, in terms of income growth, and all of these other, whatever statistic you want to look at. And what we found is just gigantic differences. And so, for example, over the last 20 years, Texas has gained something like, you know, a 58% increase in their jobs. Florida has gained something like 44% increase in jobs. And then you look at California and New York, and it's, you know, New York has almost no net new jobs over the last 20 years. They're pretty close to 0. I think they're like 4 or 5%. And California is only about 12% increase in jobs over that period. So the left has no response to this. And I'll tell you kind of one fun story, which is I debated Paul Krugman. You all know Paul Krugman, this left winger from the New York Times, and I debated him about a year ago on this stuff. And I presented this stuff, and I had these charts showing this stuff, and Krugman, and I couldn't wait to see how Paul Krugman was going to review this. He said, Steve, this is it's easy to explain why people are moving out of the Northeast and in states like Illinois, and they're moving to these southern states that you're talking about. They are leaving for the weather, right? Now, look, I mean, actually, it's not a laughable statement. I mean, because it is true that if you had your choice of living in Peoria, Illinois, or living in Minneapolis, Minnesota, or, you know, living in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, all other things equal, you want to live in a place that has more sunshine and warmer weather. So there's a lot of some truth to that, but it doesn't explain nearly everything, right? And so I just had so much fun with Krugman because I just zinged him. I said, so Paul, you're making the case that this is all about sunshine and weather. That's why people are moving from point A to point B. He said, absolutely, that explains it. So I said, okay, Paul Krugman, you've got a Nobel Prize in economics, so you can probably explain this for me. Explain to me, if it's all weather related, why people are leaving San Diego and they're going to Houston, right? Because nobody moves from San Diego to Houston for the weather. And yet, you know, as we show, right, with all that United van line data, right, that, you know, for every moving van that's moving from Houston to California, 3 are moving from California to Houston. So these trends are almost unstoppable, and they're almost irreversible. Now, one kind of interesting other point I would make about this is that, you know, in my opinion, these blue states, like California, and let me just say one other kind of interesting statistic about that. We have a whole chapter in the book about California and Texas, and it's fascinating stuff. And, you know, first of all, how do you screw up California? Right? I mean, really. I mean, beautiful mountains, beautiful beaches, beautiful women, I mean, what's not to like about California, right? I mean, it's a little slice of heaven. And yet, Sacramento, I mean, you think you've got dingbats in Springfield, Illinois. I mean, you should see these people in California. They are true nutcases. And every day they make the environment so hostile that businesses are leaving, and there's a kind of stampede. So one of my favorite statistics is over the last 5 years, in the last 5 years, Texas has gained 1 million jobs in 5 years. In fact, almost 40% of all the new jobs in the United States in this recovery have been in Texas, which is very embarrassing to liberals, right? But over that same time period, California has lost 500,000 jobs. So what you're seeing is a geographical shift of political and economic power to the red states. And the point we make in our book is these blue states have two options. They either have to change or they die, right? They either change or they become Detroit. And that really is, you know, what we're talking about. Now, the last thing I'll say, and then I'll open up to Travis, is this. Illinois. My God, Illinois. I believe that when you look at the elections that are coming up in November, in my opinion, and I'm you know, being parochial here because I'm from this great state, I believe the single most important election anywhere in any state in this country, of all the Senate races, governor's races, you know, the one that matters most is the Illinois governor's race. This one is so essential because it says everything about the future of this state. And if you re-elect, you know, you all as voters, if you re-elect Quinn, I mean, what is that saying? Keep doing what you're doing. And this state really, truly can't afford 4 more years of this. I mean, you will become like Detroit. My favorite, I say this all the time, but you know, I remember when you passed your tax increase here. What was that, 2 or 3 years ago? And one of my favorite governors, Mitch Daniels, was on the TV here, and he was asked by, I think, the Fox network, you know, what it was like to be a neighboring state of Illinois. And he said, you know, you remember this? He said, you know, being a neighboring state of Illinois is like living down the street from the Simpsons. I just thought that was a perfect, you know, analogy. So you don't want to be the Simpsons, right? You want to be the Beverly Hillbillies. You want to be the ones that are growing your economy. And what our book kind of shows, and I'm going to turn it over to Travis, is the way to do this is in that book. And so if you want to stimulate the American economy, buy that book and buy it for all your friends. Okay. Thank you all. That was great.
Okay, if I move around a little bit. It's a real pleasure to be back at the Heartland Institute. It's wonderful to see another full room here. I think, to Steve's point earlier, I asked this question, how many people feel like the future in Indiana will be brighter tomorrow than today? By show of hands. And how many people are actually from Indiana? And now, when we ask the same question pertinent to what's at stake here for you this November, how many people today feel like the future of Illinois is going to be stronger than it is now?
I think it is because Bruce Rauter is going to win that election.
That's literally what's at stake here, folks. So you have real opportunity, a very strong polarity of leadership here. And when we talk about any of the things, and there's the wealth of states is chock full, like a Gideon's Bible with all the answers in it, Old and New Testament. It's the kind of thing that needs to be in every hotel room, even if you don't always read it daily and you don't practice all of what it has available. It has the information. It has the good news. And the good news, to Steve's point, is that we look backwards at literally 50 years of everything that Art Laffer and quite honestly, any other thing in the literature related to state economic performance could suggest and then ultimately prove based on all of the evidence. Some of you remember when we were here talking about how money walks, that we looked at just one component of this as a larger part of the picture. We were looking at your IRS records, your taxpayer data files, and we on average 134 million taxpayer records per year, year over year, for the last 19 years now. And for those that don't have that information, as a reminder, you can go literally to your smartphone right now and go to your app store and pull up How Money Walks in Droid or on Apple iOS. You can literally pull down the information for your city, your county, and your state. And as you may recall, for those that have heard this, either in our appearances or back here, unfortunately, Illinois shows a deliberate, constant bleed of adjusted gross income out of particularly statewide, particularly Cook County, Illinois. Now that can be deceptive for some people that still fight the traffic leaving here to go to Aurora tonight. That can be deceptive walking the streets tonight when it's such a beautiful evening and you have a great city like Chicago. It can be deceptive thinking about the culture of what makes Chicago great, right? That we still love all the amenities and the reasons to be here. Nevertheless, as John Adams likes to remind us, facts are stubborn things. When you look at all the ways that income has been accumulated here, what you ultimately would like to see, what everyone would prefer, including everyone outside of the state, is that you're keeping that wealth and that you're returning it back in the entrepreneurial cycles so that it's productive, productive locally, that we have a city that will remain the butcher's block of the Midwest and of the world. Unfortunately, that is not happening. And so that's why it's so important that we take the energy in this room. All of you have a tremendous amount of energy and passion for liberty and freedom in all these issues that matter. And we cover on a number of them throughout the history of the 50 states. And our founding fathers wanted us to know and have information precisely like this. They expected that we would carry liberty to the next generation, and we would be vigilant about that, looking at the evidence of what has worked to create jobs and income and prosperity for every community that we serve versus policies that have failed. And so Wealth of States is a triumvirate piece of work in that regard, because we look at all of what the critics would say about all the different arguments. We peel them down, go one by one in order, and we look at how you would mathematically score this as an econometric analysis. Now, some of you would not enjoy that read, but just like the Gideon's Bible, some of the material may be heavy, but it still needs to be there. And so what people like Dr. Art Laffer have inspired us to share is that when you do the analysis, you do the deep dive, you look at all of the literature, you look at all the performance, jobs, income, population, economic performance, state contribution to the national economy, as Steve was talking about. Without Texas today, folks, imagine how much worse our national economy and our world economy would be. Literally, despite the 0.1% growth, flatline growth nationwide, without Texas, there would be much worse times today. So it's very important that we score the evidence. It's very important that we have a North Star to go back to in the literature. It's very important that candidates like Bruce Rauner here in Illinois have a shot to understand how important this is, not just for one office or one term, but to really change the trajectory of this state. Because you are literally hinged on a seesaw between going back towards policies that will create jobs and create jobs quickly, that will stop and address tough issues. When I was here the first time and learning about the Quinn tax hikes, they were all supposed to cure a big problem, right? How'd that work out? $95 billion, I think, when it was I'd first seen the news, and the only reason that they would ever take more of your every paycheck was supposed to be for a temporary, urgent crisis. Now that's been the way of every income tax since Abraham Lincoln first gave us one in the Civil War. But unlike Abraham Lincoln, who did make it temporary after the war was over, and for half of our American history, we have not had an income tax. We forget of the historical context here. For the last 50 years, there were 11 states that didn't have an income tax. We take a chapter in Wealth of States and look at how each of those 11 states that chose to adopt a price on work, because that's what a state income tax is. We have different prices we place on work. In California, the top price on work is now 13.3%. In Texas, the price of work is 0. Because Texas, Tennessee, Florida, New Hampshire, Washington State, Nevada, South Dakota, a few others there I may be missing, are Wyoming, are among the 9 states that has a 0 price on work. So if prices and incentives really do matter, and that's something that we as economists can rarely dispute in all of the evidence, then we exist in a highly competitive place. Our founding fathers therefore knew that we would score this out, that we would take and apply the lessons of what has been working. We would ultimately have over time a look at how jobs and income would be performing. And that's exactly what we do. We see the inverse and exactly what you want to see. Steve mentioned the job performance of Texas. I'll mention a few other examples. Florida has surpassed New York as the second most populous state in the country. There are 20 million Floridians today. It's eclipsing New York State. How many people have visited New York as a tourist? Quite a few, most of you. How many tourists would you estimate go to New York City last year? Anybody? Blurt out a number. Let's crowdsource it.
3 million.
3 million. Well, way much more than that.
20 million.
More than that.
100 million?
About less than that. About 52 million people will visit New York City from last year's tourist numbers. Right? That's an incredible city. It depends on tourism, just like Chicago depends on tourism, just like Los Angeles depends on tourism. Florida is on track this year to receive 100 million tourists. 100 million, half of which there will be more tourists to Orlando, Florida this year than New York City. Okay. Now, it's not just about tourism. They stay an average of 4.4 days for every, dollar of tourism. You've got jobs related to that, and all that's well and good for Florida. But there's more. A guest becomes a part-time resident becomes a full-time resident, and a full-time resident brings jobs and family and kids and grandkids and a lot of other things. And that's what we can't measure strictly in economic terms, but Wealth of States looks back at the inverse of that activity. What would be the inverse? New Jersey, Connecticut once had no income tax. Places that invented telecommunications and microwaves and a lot of other things outside of places like New York City. In 11 of 11 cases, our book bears out that no state has ever taxed its way into prosperity. I know that would surprise you in this audience. Now, what we can't do is preach only to our choir. What we have to do now is make the evidence easy to digest, transferable to your neighbors, and with impact, emotional empathy to the best interests of your communities if we're going to see a better future for a state like Illinois. So what we've tried to do with Wealth of States is score out anything, any curiosity that might exist. So when you get past the economic evidence that jobs are better in low-tax states, taxpayers are fleeing from high-tax states to low-tax states, passenger traffic out of O'Hara is not keeping up with passenger traffic in the FAA records for the last 20 years into states like Texas and Florida. When you look at the price of U-Hauls leaving Chicago being very different than the price of U-Hauls coming into Chicago, real-time supply and demand data that scores out literally the demand on services. Once you load up that U-Haul, does a Chicago resident care if it's going to Des Moines, Illinois, or Phoenix, Arizona, or Fort Myers? No, once the U-Haul is loaded, it's their problem. I'll see you on the back end of it. And so what we see is that these migrations are impacting 50 million Americans, $2 trillion of adjusted gross income swing, and today 1 in 5 people who have a job, any kind of job, they're part of U.S. employment, reside in a state with no price on work, 0 income tax. 1 in 5. It's the highest since 1976, since these records have been recorded. So, no matter how you splice it and dice it, you don't see it from the opposite side of the fence with states that are choosing to adopt a tax. And by our records, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, from January 2011, which was such an unusual time and unusual thing to have corporate personal income tax hiked at that period of time, we show Well, our last scoring, a loss of 11 jobs per hour in this state when you raise the price on work. Now, your legislature knows that when you raise the price of something, you expect less of it. How do we know they know that? Because they raised your cigarette taxes. Remember that? It wasn't just a slight raise, they raised it by over $1 a pack. And the goal was, you raise the price of something, right? You want to see less of it. So, to your progressive friends that may have a different political persuasion than you need to ask them the question this fall, well, if you raise the price of smoking to see less smoking, why would you not expect to see less work when you raise that price on work? Therefore, if we let those tax hikes expire and go back to a lower price on work, what should we expect more of? More work, more jobs. So, and just like in the case of the cigarette tax revenue, that was supposed to, anticipated for your bottom line state coffers to generate $350 million. What did it actually raise? A year after the implementation, it didn't meet its revenue target. Tax collections like this rarely do, regardless of how it's being collected. It was $100 million short. Why? Because you can buy cigarettes somewhere else, like my home state of Missouri, which is proud to sell Illinoisans cheap cigarettes. So when people have choice, when people have competition, and that competition works absolutely, it shouldn't be a surprise that consumers do what's in their own best interest. Now, but we don't stop there with wealth of states. In the back of the Gideon's Bible, we go deeper. We look at, well, okay, so we need government. We need government for essential public services, right? There are things that we can't do well for ourselves. I can't easily build a tollway to O'Hare Airport on my own, even if I have power of eminent domain, which I shouldn't have as an individual. I can't easily assimilate a public school system, even though I could probably improve the delivery of education for a variety of ways that are competitive. And there are certain things that we can't do for certain members of society easily on our own, so we depend on those services. So, even in the case, as mentioned, the comparison, probably the most diametrically opposite states, like California on one hand, being the leader. If you were to listen to those that disagree with you here, you would say, well, let's follow the example of California, right? Let's follow the example of New York. So we look at that, and we compare that to the example that we've talked often about with Texas, but not from an economic point of view, not from a tax collection point of view. We look deeper, and we look at the horsepower that comes from tax collections into the state, the processing of getting that to where it needs to go through appropriations and the halls of government, and then ultimately the dissemination of that for the public benefit through state agencies, hopefully getting to things that we talk about that are essential in state government, like Medicaid, social services, investment in education, providing infrastructure and transportation, those kinds of things. Make sense? You with me so far? All right. So the bad news for the other side, the reason that no one wants to debate Steve Moore, including Paul Krugman, is that when you do that, you find some startling evidence. You find that Texas has more educators per 10,000 residents in the classroom than California does. You find that growth in the revenue stream and the efficiency of a smaller government sometimes puts a lot more lead on target for the programs that you actually want to see. And so we have oodles and oodles of that kind of evidence there. Happy to take particular questions as it may relate to your neighborhood here, because we want you to leave confident and competent that the arguments and the evidence is there. We even dedicate almost pretty much a whole chapter on what every possible argument that a critic could come up and concoct with. So, and we break that down piece by piece. So America, each generation has to save itself. You know, we do not, liberty is not passed automatically through our DNA, folks. And it's everyone's shot at liberty here. So economic opportunity and all the other things that our states make possible are simply too important to not go out and be a part of this and advocate for what's right in your community. So We've done all the evidence. When we look back at the IRS taxpayer data file, we're going back at least to 1992, which was a significant year, right? You remember what happened in 1992? Who remembers where you were in 1992? Okay, let's get that in our mind. 1992 was the year that Al Gore invented the internet. Yeah, we have taxpayer records and how money walks and related to our migration to go at least back to 1992, and a lot of this evidence goes back literally 50 years. So we're very excited to be able to share it with you. Very excited to take your questions and answers here, and we want to get to anything else that would help you become a leading advocate for liberty. Yes, in the back. Go ahead.
The notion of the Lone Star as Lone Star, what do you think is the impact of them having a part-time legislature?
Yeah, so actually question was, if you didn't hear it, is there, I'm going to paraphrase, is there a correlation to part-time legislatures and state spending? We actually looked at it, as an aside, we looked at literally the size of revised statutes, the number of books that go up on the shelf, which I think is highly correlated to part-time residency. In a state like New Hampshire shows you a best example. They have over 430 local reps, which it's one of the most popular.
They don't have, in New Hampshire, the legislators don't have offices, they have lockers.
He's not joking. They literally have lockers.
Yeah.
And what you do see from a legislature that is part-time is A, the size of government tends to be smaller. The attention span on appropriations and critical core issues tends to be very focused for the time period that they're there, if the legislature is not there for very long. And the important thing besides that argument is that part-time means what? You're doing something else the other time, right? So if you're doing something else, that means you have another kind of employment, and or maybe you're taking care of your family, or you're fortunate to contribute to your community in different ways.
Well, Texas has a part-time legislature.
And you see that in Indiana as well. The number of farmers in the legislature, if they're staying late just to debate something meaningless, those farmers want to get home to finish corn and soybeans in the field. And when you hear about people in New Hampshire and they think about an issue, they're thinking about it as a forester, or as a small business owner, or from another frame of reference than a full-time politician. And that has intangible value that I would argue. Steve, you have anything else to add?
That's good. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
In the movie America,
I haven't seen it yet.
If you haven't seen it, everybody should see it. Elizabeth Warren makes this sweeping statement that the 1% are rich. Basically, no one ever got rich by themselves, and they got rich off of the taxes that everybody else paid. She ignores the fact that the top 20% pay 70% of the taxes. And my question to you is, when will you be debating her?
You know, for the last 3 or 4 years, I've told people that, you know, the most important thing for our movement, you know, is to defeat her in 2016. And now I'm not so sure her is going to be Hillary. I mean, Elizabeth Warren, I think, is a real danger to Hillary as a potential Democratic candidate. You know, now people say, wait a minute, we would never elect for president a junior senator who has no experience in the private sector. Right? That would never happen in this country. Right? Never. Yeah, you know, I mean, I have to say, in my lifetime, in 30 years in politics, the biggest upset that I've ever seen politically was Barack Obama beating Hillary in 2008. I didn't see that coming from a mile away. This one I can see coming, and Hillary is very nervous about Elizabeth Warren. She is a first-rate demagogue, right? I mean, she's really good at being a left-wing demagogue. You stated the statistic. I mean, we talk about this in the book. Let's just talk about the top 1 or 2%. You know, the people who have been demonized, the Warren Buffetts and the Bill Gates and the Tiger Woods and the Hannah Montanas and the evil people like that. You know, if you look at the vast majority of people in that top category, guess what they do? What for a living? They own, invest, and operate small businesses. That's what they do for a living. And they're the nation's employers, right? My old boss, Dick Armey, used to say that liberals love jobs, but they hate employers. You know, you can't have one without the other. And so, you know, I used to debate, you know, Justin, you were talking about, you know, when I used to do Larry Kudlow's show. Did anyone ever watch Larry's show on, you know, I miss Larry so much, but, you know, he used to have me debate Robert Reich, you know, twice a week for 10 years, you know, and nice guy, actually, we got to be kind of friends, just when it comes to this stuff, he just doesn't have his trade table in left, right, and left position. He just does not understand these economic concepts at all. And he'd always say, you know, we need more jobs in this country. We need more. And I say, Bob, of course we need more jobs. How are you going to get more jobs if you're going to tax the businesses that create the jobs? I mean, this isn't complicated stuff, right? This is not brain surgery. And in 10 years on that show, he never once had an answer to that question.
Kevin, can I add just 2 points related to Illinois' situation here, where you find yourself, you know, hearing out of Springfield? First of all, some point throughout our lives, there's a life cycle where many people in America hit the top 20th percentile. You may not know when it is. It might relate to how you and your significant other relate. It may relate to a surge in a business or something you didn't expect. But that mobility up and down the tax table is a function of the American dream, and we do not want to disturb or destroy that or suggest for one reason that it's rigid in price. At the lowest end of this ladder, we don't want to make it harder to get on the ladder so you can climb up with minimum wage hikes. And at the other end of the ladder, we don't want to make it seem as though it's unattainable, because that in fact is not true, whether you're a small business owner or not. And so that relates to you because you have a constitution in your state that makes it hard for them to adjust to a progressive income tax. There are some that might passively suggest that it's, well, it's okay because as I was flying in today, I see Trump on a black, you know, plane, and he's the one gonna pay that. Well, he's got his own plane. He knows how to evade that situation. He's not going to be caught in that situation. He is you that will be caught in that situation if you enable and take off the constitutional protections to keep your price on work as low and as flat as possible, thereby improving income mobility and addressing income inequality the right way through opportunity.
Back in the back there? You might have to shout it out because the acoustics are not great.
That's okay. Yeah, I was wondering, in terms of the job loss in New York and California, I was wondering how...
Did you say job loss? Oh, job loss.
Yeah, job loss in New York and California, the states. How much can deindustrialization and globalization explain that? I mean, over the last 20 years, we've seen jobs be from factory states like New York and California to China and other parts of the third world. So how much does deindustrialization explain that job loss?
Well, you know, America's not deindustrialized. I mean, it has deindustrialized in the last 5 years, but, you know, the truth is we haven't been deindustrializing. I mean, in the 80s and 90s, we had the biggest, you know, boom we ever saw, and a lot of that was in manufacturing. And it's interesting. I mean, manufacturing is even coming back now, not as rapidly as we would like to see, but there is a bit of a manufacturing renaissance going on in this country. Let me give you an example. The auto industry. I mean, the auto industry has not disappeared in America. It's just not in Michigan anymore.
Alabama and Mississippi.
Exactly. I mean, so this is an important point, though. I mean, where are all the auto jobs now? Well, they're in Texas, they're in Tennessee, they're in Alabama, they're South Carolina, and it's interesting. This one, you know, you sparked my memory on this. I've got to say this because did you all follow what happened in Chattanooga earlier this year, where they tried to, and the UAW tried to install this union? I went down there a couple times. I think you probably did too, and you know, the argument I made, and we speak to town hall meetings, 300 people, civic leaders, a lot of the workers on the floor would come, and you know, the argument we made to these workers was very crystal clear. Don't turn Chattanooga into Detroit. Right? And by the way, what happened in Detroit has really affected American psyche. Right? They understand what happens when liberalism runs amok. If these states keep on the path they're on, they will become Detroit. And that was exactly the line that we used. Now, we won that vote. With the secret ballot, the UAW lost, and when the workers were asked why they voted against it, a lot of them said exactly what we had said: don't turn Chattanooga into Detroit. I bring that up. This is kind of a side point, but it's important. I don't know how many of you saw what happened a few days ago in Chattanooga, the UAW is going to create a, quote, voluntary union. Wait a minute, they lost the vote, a Democratic vote of the workers, and now they're going to install a union anyway, quote, voluntarily. You know, the way I put this is like, well, maybe Mitt Romney should say I'm the voluntary president. Right? I lost the election. And so this is a very dangerous thing, because they're using this as a kind of foothold, because if they can unionize that plant in Chattanooga, then they're going to move into Texas, they're going to move into these other states. And one of the points that we find so overwhelmingly is that states that are right to work is where especially new businesses, are being created. If Bruce Rauner wins, one of the first things he ought to do, if he can, is to make the great state of Illinois a right to work state.
And if I could just answer two other points to your question. If you're asking about the Industrial Revolution from the North shifting elsewhere, things like climate have really been improved by technology. Air conditioning was a big deal for the Sun Belt states, because it means you can manufacture in climate control. It used to be 100 years ago the best place to build and make things was in the northern tier of the industrial belt, and that has equalized out. But I will suggest, in terms of globalization, it's far more important to look at the service and knowledge economy today. And if you look at that, from our point of view, America still stands much to gain, much to lead with, because we have incredible flexibility on how we do our work, who we do our work with, how work is redefined in a knowledge economy. And all of that, if you look at it from the standpoint of what's a tax table that makes sense, if you know that people are going to be more global, more easy to move around, more nimble with the use of technology, why would you want to have a rigid structure on the price of your work and your earnings that is largely based on location and not based on creating a nexus where you want to locate, like Hong Kong, Dubai, Ireland, or anywhere else? Yes, sir.
Okay. You and then you.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Can't have two people.
I want the state lawmaker to.
Do I have to pay him off?
Go ahead.
Before the income tax brought in revenue to the federal government, the major sources of revenue were tariffs.
And beer.
Yeah.
Say again?
Beer.
Okay.
And land sales.
Yeah.
Certainly,
Which we could still, there's a lot of land we could still sell.
to a system where tariffs are a major source of revenue. After all, it was one of the underlying causes for the Civil War.
Sure. And we're not suggesting that tariffs are an alternative revenue stream. Congressman Dave Camp likes to say that our U.S. tax code is 10 times the size of the Bible and full of none of its good news. There's no dispute, even with Barack Obama, that the U.S. tax code, which he's been public on, is far too complicated. The issue is, how do you get to real alternative changes? And that is difficult, folks. Today, your candidate for governor brought some ideas towards that in terms of stepping that back. But it's difficult once you start, because you create a dependency on literally billions of dollars here. So it takes some time, it takes some effort, it takes some pain. But generally, when you're looking at revenue replacement models, you've got a rate change, you've got a base change of what you can apply it to, and then you have plus or minus deductions, credits, loopholes, or exemptions. And the average state is taxing about 40% or less of all the eligible things they could be taxing on a consumption orientation. That means that 60% of the things that occur in the boundaries of what we call Illinois are going tax-free. Now, we didn't intend to do it that way. 80 years ago, we thought the only thing that you would ever be able to collect revenue from was a durable good, something that you would trade with a tariff, something that would be exchanged physically. And today, over 2/3 of our economy is service-based. It's 2/3 is based on intangible things or exchange of information for other kinds of benefits, other kinds of currencies. And that's likely to just keep accelerating. So we're going to have to give our leadership a little flexibility and a little bit of cover if they're going to try to step down a production and an earnings tax in order to see more production and earnings.
So, I'm not for a tariffs, but our corporate income tax, effectively what we do, you all know this, with our 35% corporate tax, which is the highest in the world, you all know that, and we're essentially imposing a tariff on our own goods and services. It's really one of the most the dumbest policies I've ever seen in my life. We put a 35% tariff on everything we produce, and then then we try to sell it overseas. Our corporate income tax system is a Head Start program for every country that competes against it. I mean, it's unbelievable, and just in the last about 2 months, we've seen 4 or 5 major American companies, iconic companies, Pfizer, Medtronic, which is a multi-billion-dollar medical device company, Walgreens, and 2 others just in the last week that are kind of smaller, but they're billion-dollar companies that are basically saying they're going to move out of the United States and they're going to move to Ireland or Indonesia or India, other countries where tax rates are so much lower. I mean, the only point I'm making is the point we make in our book about states is obviously true about countries as well. Yep. And, I wrote a column today on this. It is unpatriotic. I use that word unpatriotic. It is unpatriotic for any politician in Washington to support a 35% corporate rate. We are exporting American jobs abroad. And it's just outrageous. And then Obama gives a speech, well, we're going to just tax them even if they move their stuff overseas. Well, then what happens? You just don't have American companies anymore, right? All those companies become German companies and Indian companies and Irish companies, and we're not even the home to any Fortune 500 companies. It's a very dangerous trend that we're on.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So in all your research, I mean, my concern here, sitting in Illinois, is one, our debt load and minimal growth. So it's hard when you have minimal growth to get over your debt load.
Yep.
If you have growth, you can kind of massage it along, right? But when you look at Chicago specifically, in the top of all the top 20 cities, I mean, it's at the bottom. It's worse than Detroit when you look at its revenues to debt load. It's 683% of its revenues that it has in debt. So essentially, you could pay everything into the revenue stream for 7 years, not provide one service, and finally you pay off the debt. So given that, plus kind of the culture that we have here in terms of, it's a little bit pay to play, I'm just, if we got some reforms going, how long do you think it would take? And is there all this uncertainty still surrounding Illinois and its politics, the businesses still shy away?
Well, let's start with Chicago. I mean, I'm biased, but Chicago is a world-class city, right? I mean, there is no reason Chicago is not the Hong Kong of the Midwest, the United States. I mean, it's a parochial thing to say, but if you live in the Midwest, where else do you want to live besides Chicago, right? You don't want to live in Cincinnati or Cleveland or, these, armpits of America like that. You want to live in Chicago, right? And so,
thankfully, didn't say St. Louis.
Yeah, so, no, I mean, so this city has, what I'm saying is the upside is phenomenal for the city, phenomenal, except for these problems, all the ones that you identified, the enormous debt load, the incompetent leadership. I thought that the real end of the mayor's, mayorship was when he caved into the teachers' unions, his first 6 months in office. He should have, don't you agree, he should have stood up to those teachers' unions who are getting these ridiculous, pensions and so on, and if he had stood up with them, he would have been a very different mayor. I think he could have actually been a success, but the Democrats are just incapable. We see this in city and state after state. The Democrats are wholly owned subsidiaries of the teachers' unions, and there's no state that's more true than, and by the way, this in the legislature, I hate to say this, but a lot of the Republicans are bought off by the teachers' unions as well, and they've bought off both parties. Until you take on the teachers' unions, which is really, truly the evil empire, it's going to be difficult to see real reform. And I love what, sorry to go on this, but I just want to make this point. We met this afternoon with Bruce Rauner. He's doing exactly the right thing. He's going to black churches and black neighborhoods and black towns and saying, you know what? Your schools are rotten, and I'm going to give you all sorts of opportunities outside of these terrible schools with tenured teachers that are incompetent to be in front of classrooms. And God bless him for doing that. He's exactly right about that.
Gene, if I can just add, these problems accumulated over a long period of time. The indifference towards those problems were past many different mayors in the case of the city finances and debt. So they don't unwind and revamp themselves, without some time as well. But there can be notable strides done. It's remarkable what leadership can do for coaching the right team. If you look at even the Chicago Bears with a great coach versus the Chicago Bears without a great coach, the difference in the NFL from top to bottom is so razor thin that that coach really matters. And you've seen example after example, we touch on that in Wealth of States, examples of states that have turned themselves around from by contracting their spending, putting everything on path, literally creating billions of dollars of state surplus within a first term of a governor. Now, that's not quick enough if you've got other things to deal with, and if the debt is accumulated over too long a period, the extremes that are necessary become more and more dramatic. So the notion for some out there of a city going bankrupt sounds ludicrous, but we haven't probably seen the end of that situation, and it's not just reserved for Detroit. You know, I think every American wants to see cities like this come back, but we have to first start with the reality of where we are. And I think it's still not true that people understand the debt load situation of this city, and it's partially hard to do when you walk outside and you see so many great things. So there has to be a real leader communicate the reality of that situation.
Another name that I'd like you to mention is Jim Oberweis, because there's a chance that Mr. Durbin's had his run. And I do too, and I'm optimistic about this. You know, we worked at Bruce Rowley came up with the term limit petition. We needed 350,000 signatures to be safe to get it on the ballot. We got 592,000.
For term limits?
Yes.
I'm a fanatic about term limits.
Yes, and if Mr. Oberweis doesn't use that in his debates with Mr. Durbin, he's making a big mistake, but I'm not sure he does.
Okay. We've got questions in the back. I want to get to enough people. Yeah.
You're not really talking about spending. We're actually number one in a couple categories in Illinois. We have 43,000 elected officials. So
42,000?
43,000.
Oh my
God!
God!
School board, they're not paid, but they're still people we elect. In Wilmette, I vote for 88 people in a cycle that represent me. That actually doesn't really represent.
Do you feel well represented?
We have 7,000 taxing districts, or over 7,000. But my concern is the politicians in Illinois. So this past couple of years, they passed tanning bed legislation. You can't go to a tanning bed. If you buy a puppy at Petco and it dies, you get a refund. You can't eat shark fin. This is our legislature. They're worried about things that maybe they're important. I don't want to debate those, but this is what they're. I don't want to offend any of the politicians in here.
You mean you can't eat shark fins in this state? This is not a free state.
and again, if you get a puppy and he dies, you have to get a refund. And this is what they're doing.
Yeah.
So where is the hope on getting any kind of spending reform, pension reform?
But let me just say something really quick on that. I'm going to disagree slightly with Travis on one thing. I actually think, let's take Michigan for example. You know, Michigan's been in a state that's been down for a long time. You know, in 2010, I forget what year it was. I think it was 2010. Rick Snyder. When was Rick Snyder elected? Was it 2010? I mean, this he's done a phenomenal job. He's not a high-profile guy. He doesn't yell and scream, but what I'm saying is, you start turning those dials in the right direction, because right now they're turned in, fully in the wrong direction. You start turning those dials even just a little bit, but hopefully even halfway to where you want to get. I think you can see, you can see a big turnaround. Michigan actually is going through believe it or not, outside of Detroit, Michigan's doing really pretty well right now. I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal about a few months ago. I mean, Grand Rapids, unbelievable what's going on there, and so. I'm optimistic, actually. I think you guys take over the governorship and you get some of these changes. I think it could really electrify the state in a big way.
You can go to her, but I just want to say, Art Laffer, if he were here as part of the Wealth of States, would probably remind us very quickly and succinctly that government spending is taxation.
Yep.
Okay, whether it's a state or federal or local level, if you're being, if you're spending something, it's spending something of yours, and you need to determine whether it could be more efficiently spent on your own. Yes.
I wanted to ask on two things. One, as a first generation Hispanic in South America.
Yeah.
Immigrants came here legally. I was wondering how you might, and we have a huge influx coming in right now to Chicago.
Influx of
told in Maryville,
Hispanics.
they took in a bunch, but how do you think this illegal immigration tidal wave that's coming in around the border is affecting, going to affect Illinois? And second, what you see going on with this billionaire, I think his name is Tim Draper in California, who wants to break up California into 6 separate states. What's the, so those are the things. How is the illegal immigration stuff, would that affect Illinois? And then the 6th state.
Well, I'll let you deal with the California issue. On the immigration thing, look, I mean, anybody who wants to come to this country and work, I'm for it. Anybody who wants to come to the country and go on welfare, I'm against it. You know, it's really that simple. I mean, if you've got Hispanics who want to come to this state and work, hell yes, why wouldn't you want them? I mean, these are the hardest working people in the world. And as long as, you know, they're not collecting all these, you know, government benefits, I'm for it. I mean, look, every hotel I go to, every restaurant I go to, the people who are doing the hard work and the grunt work in this country are immigrants, and that's our heritage. So, Illinois would do well to have more immigrants, quite frankly. You may not agree with that, but I certainly think it would. Look, you can't blame immigrants on the problem of this state. It's your policies are all wrong. I mean, you look at states like Texas. Texas has more immigrants than any other state, and it's booming like crazy. And a lot of that boom is a result of the Hispanic immigrants who've created a boom in that state. But go ahead. On this California thing, you think they're going to...
Well, I think the issue there is what's fair about the process, making sure it's the right kind of process, making sure it's the same kind of process that everybody had an opportunity for, and then being honest about fixing when it's not fair, whether you're here or there or there or here. But I think demographically what Steve's pointing out is we depend on fresh blood. We always have. The conditions and where it comes from has always been changing in America, but we depend on a lot of those things to be balanced. And we're not getting it done right. We're not getting it done right? So in terms of the 6th California model, that's something I blogged now twice about with Forbes. This is a Draper model that's premised on the fact that 38 million people have no government. It's ungovernable because it's too large. And so what we did is we took a look at all the counties proposed in the model, and we looked at exactly how it would work if the public of California were to adopt it. And what we found generally was that you do have very different economic futures in a 6-state California model.
Better or worse?
In Northern California, in Sacramento and Silicon Valley, it's conceivable, at least looking backwards at how they've been performing, that they could do well. In the Central Valley, you have an agricultural state that would rival Florida just on its own. Right. San Diego would actually do okay in the Southern Rim. The big story there in California, what's not being dealt with is Los Angeles. Los Angeles is responsible for 36 of the $45 billion adjusted gross income loss as a state. And when you isolate that problem, you shrink it down.
That's true.
They would have to deal with all the tough issues that you're asking about. It's taxation, spending, debt, fairness to delivery of service for benefits involved. So having said that, it's a Herculean lift that won't happen before 2016. They've collected over 800,000 signatures. You can read more about it on our Forbes blog if you want to. And it has all sorts of rare national political consequences. If there are 6 Californias now, not 1 in the United States.
Plus it would have to, the states would have to approve that as well. So it's a pretty heavy lift.
Now,
it terrifies me, the idea of 12 Barbara boxers in the Senate.
Exactly. I do think it's an important conversation. It starts the conversation with people there. Silicon Valley entrepreneurs want a different conversation about the future of their state.
We'll take two more quick questions. This one and that one, then we got to...
That's a really good segue. 12 Barbara boxers. So this is my question. I know the Republicans want to take back the U.S. Senate. And you mentioned earlier that the states are getting either they're getting redder or bluer. But what about the total number of what are considered red states or blue states? Because what I'm thinking is the population is moving to those states, making them redder. That's going to increase the representation in the Congress. But in the Senate, you're still going to have 2 senators per state, doesn't matter if they're red or blue, but, you know, so how do you see that playing out over the next?
Well, we have I think this is in our book, the stuff about the Northeast. And I mean, the Northeast is just being bled to death. I mean, you know, those states like New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, Rhode Island. I mean, literally Rhode Island, if these trends continue, there'll be like 2 people left in Rhode Island. I mean, so what's happening is that the political power of the Northeast is just being eroded census after census after census. So they've lost already in the last 3 censuses about 30% of their electoral in the House and in the Electoral College, and they're going to lose another 20%, you know, over the next 20 years or so if these things, you know, continue. And that's why, you know, I started this out by saying those states either going to have to change or they die. They become politically and economically irrelevant.
So 2 equal opposite forces I sense from your question. One is we have a trend towards urbanization compared to a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations ago. More people are choosing to gain on trade by whatever they do for a living in a city. And that speaks to cities becoming bluer and more dominant towards blue state models.
That's right.
Opposite that, however, is jobs and economic growth. So I want to use my home state as an experience for that. Missouri and Iowa were one of only two states in the country in the last 100 years to have never had a single decade of double-digit growth. So they've been stagnant the last 100 years. So Missouri used to be a bellwether state among national politics. It was a place you would go to run down the middle and sort out who would be president. It's no longer true. But St. Louis and Kansas City are very blue cities. What has happened? The proportional shift towards fiscally red policies is not so much a validation of rural trends in outstate Missouri as much as it is the decline, the urban decline for the absence of job and income growth. So there are physically fewer people in the urban areas in these instances because they don't have the economic opportunity, so they go to Texas and Florida and other places. So it kind of depends state by state how this breaks down to your question. Generally at the House of Lords versus House of Commons kind of main battle royal, it's true that it would favor red policies in the U.S. Senate and bluer policies, but we're currently in a trend that's counter-cyclical to that because of other things.
The one downside, there is one downside to all of this interstate migration. This is, I thought, where you were headed with this, is look what's happened to Colorado. Look what's happened. I mean, Colorado used to be a very reliably red state, right? But guess where everybody's coming into Colorado from? California. And guess what? How they're voting? Democratic. So Colorado, as a result of this migration, has actually become a more Democrat. The same thing in New Hampshire. I mean, New Hampshire is the live free or die state, right? I mean, it's traditionally one of the most libertarian states. Guess where all the migration is coming in from? Massachusetts. Guess how they're voting? You know, it's so frustrating because the people are moving to states that are freer, and then they're voting for the policies that they abandoned. So that's, to me, one of the one kind of downsides of this migration pattern. We got to have a way.
It does really depend on leadership, though. You look at the state of Texas, summer forecasting could be blue.
That's never going to happen
within 10 years. Well, I've asked current and previous governors of Texas about that, and those who are of conservative persuasion would always say it depends on who's in office. If they reach out to their people, there's no way. So people like George Bush carried, you know, almost 50% of Hispanics. People like Governor Perry, each election have carried 44 to 46%. And that's not happening at the national level because the outreach is not occurring correctly. They're not doing what he was suggesting Bruce Rauner is every weekend here in Chicago, visiting neighborhoods where they themselves have laid out the best interest for their community. And absolutely no substitute for that leadership. Yes, question in the back.
Returning to your research, you said that no state has ever taxed with prosperity. And I want to ask how that statement holds internationally. Take, for example, the Scandinavian.
Yeah.
They've had 7 decades, almost 20th century, in fact, they've had tax rates, income tax rates, at 40–50%. And they are among the most wealthy states in the world. So how do you explain this? How does your research explain this? How do you isolate the income tax to determine whether or not the state is doing well?
Yeah. So the question is, when we say no state in America is taxes way into prosperity, we specifically talk about 11 states. How do we do that? We look at the gross state product from the date of enacting a price on work where none was previous to that date. And then we give it, regardless of a time series of whether it was 1955, 1975, we adjust for 5 and 10 years later. And in 11 of 11 cases, the GSP, the gross state product, as a percent of the national economy, the national GDP, declined. In 11 of 11 cases. And those are the only ones. I can't speak to Scandinavia. We don't have that data. It would be wonderful if we did. There are other institutions that often ask us and collaborate with us and want us to share that, but it's obviously a limitation of different taxing jurisdictions, different governments, different standards on governments. Who's heard about this Piketty thing anyway? Well, I think that's been successfully refuted a number of times, but one of the reasons it has is because you can't always correlate the methodologies over those time series unless you can get to apples comparisons. That's why we did exactly that with interstate competition and look-backs using the same standards that did not shift.
So you found a very strong correlation. However, you do agree that there are different models, policy models,
sure,
that do not imply low taxes but do achieve high growth. We see it in different cases, right?
I couldn't hear what he said.
He's saying, can we mutually coexist with alternative models? Absolutely.
That's the great thing about America, right?
And,
you know,
and so we're not disputing that Scandinavia may find a better tax system that works for them. But keep in mind there are a lot of other demographics that go into that. And when you look at it general across the world, it generally points towards the evidence that we see occurring within the 50 states on interstate competition.
You know, one last thing, and then we'll let you all go. I mean, we're not. Krugman wrote this column about our book, and he said, "Oh, you know, Brown and Laffer and Moore and Sickerfeld, they think like this that tax cuts are some kind of magic, you know, pixie dust, you know," and we are not. We are not saying that taxes are the only thing that matter for why one state grows over another. I mean, there are 100 reasons. You know, weather matters. You know, Paul Krugman is right. If you want to live somewhere that has sunshine every day and so on, hell yeah, rather than live somewhere that has a winter like you had in Chicago this year, right? But we are saying that when you hold all these other factors, you know, constant, taxes are a pretty important component, and the right to work is a pretty important component. You know, we did go through this stuff. I mean, it's not just observational. I mean, we've been kind of giving you the kind of these kind of anecdotes, but we find very strong statistical significance. That is to say, this didn't happen by chance, or the probability that all of these migration patterns happen by chance is like 1 out of 100. So it's probable that these things really do matter, and as we say in our book, they matter a lot. And this is why Illinois, if they could make 2 changes, you know, lower your income tax rate and become a right-to-work state, that would be like injecting rocket fuel into this state, and you would see tremendous amounts of growth, and then you'd see a comeback. I mean, when I grew up in this state, when did Illinois adopt an income tax, by the way? How long is the... Anybody know? When was it?
69.
Yeah, I mean, think about this. In the 60s, Illinois was able to balance budget. It didn't have all this debt. You know, now you've got first 2, then 3, then 5. What's the income tax now? 5 or 6%? I forget what. 5. And now you got all this debt. You can't. You know, the other example that Arthur loves to use is New Jersey. New Jersey, correct me if I'm wrong about these statistics. 1965, New Jersey had neither an income nor a sales tax, right? Not an income or a sales tax. 50 years later, they have the highest income tax, almost in the country, and almost the highest sales tax, and they're the most indebted state in the country, you know, behind only California and Illinois. You know, so these high taxes haven't done anything to improve the fiscal situation. Did I get those facts straight, by the way?
I think so, and Jim, he's given us the candidate.
All right. Jim, thank you.